I already have been getting some questions from the audience. One was from Corin Williams, and he wanted to know what exactly did we mean by lobbying, because could mean a lot of things, and what does this mean for ShipMD in the context of improving reimbursement? Does anyone in the panel have any thoughts about that? I think, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, maybe. Well, so this is Chester. I think I tried to mention that toward the conclusions, but I do think, I would probably use the word advocacy, and I believe that ShipMD will not be the advocate, but will work with advocacy partners such as AAP, which we know is a very strong advocate for children in Washington, D.C., as well as patient advocacy groups. So I think they're the ones, I think we can provide the facts, we can provide best recommendations. I think that's probably where ShipMD will best fill a role.
Kanwalji,
yes.
If I can add to Chester's point, which I think is important, but I'd also want to invite Vasan and Tara, because they've been so helpful in coordinating the different work streams. If we determine that we've got to get statutory changes in order to create a new pediatric device reimbursement system, that is a form of lobbying at the U.S. congressional level. And I think we've got to continue to think carefully, what will that mission be? I think there's a very different lobbying effort to federal agencies and also state agencies. But I think Chester very accurately characterized those as advocacy, not the classic lobbying on the Hill. And so I think these are different functions depending on what we're trying to achieve. I believe SHIP needs to be prepared for all of those efforts. And I would also just underscore, as Chester said, we've got participants in SHIP, particularly the American Academy of Pediatrics, who really know this space. They are very good at moving the needle at all levels of government. And sometimes, whether it's advocacy, it also needs to be educational to those decision-making processes. So if I had to define lobbying, I'd say educational, advocacy, and looking carefully at who's on the other side of that receiving information. But I would value what Vasan and Tara may have in mind.
So this is Tara Federici with AdvaMed, and I just want to, I think both Chester and Gordon have characterized it well. What we're talking about for a longer term objective associated with ShipMD is an advocacy campaign to try and implement some of these key objectives that they have laid out so well in their presentation. So things like increased reimbursement for devices, a breakthrough designation process that mirrors what's already being done on the adult side. Those are things that would require legislation and an advocacy and education campaign. It wouldn't be done by ShipMD directly. It would be done by the stakeholders, and obviously AAP is a primary stakeholder in this space. But there are many stakeholders who've worked hard on this, and they could be part of a coalition to help educate and message some of these important goals. So hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah, Wade, I think, Wade, you have some thoughts about that, right? I think you're on mute, Wade.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that there was a process that occurred in Medicare, which led to their clinical trials, basically their clinical trials policy, coverage with evidence development. And it was that the Institute of Medicine did a study and a report in about the early 2000s called Extending Medicare Reimbursement in Clinical Trials. And I think that report, which was well received and laid out the history of how the Category B devices, the interagency agreements, and the pilot project of lung volume reduction surgery being covered by the National Emphysema Treatment Trial being covered by Medicare. And it laid down a case for more flexible coverage in Medicare in adults for clinical trials. It seems to me that an IOM, or now National Academy of Medicine, study and report on extending Medicaid reimbursement in clinical trials for innovative pediatric devices, a little bit too long of a title, but might be something to advocate for, to sort of lay everything out in an NAM report.
And in part, what you and Tara has been mentioning, it in part answers the question that also we got from Gary, that while the navigation Workstream in the morning said that lobbying is strictly not in scope of SHIP-MD, but it is cited as an opportunity here. So yes, I think both of those are true. At the same time, SHIP-MD is not supposed to be doing advocacy by itself, but a coalition of stakeholders certainly can, and they certainly will. I think, Vasu, you also have some thoughts about that, right?
Thank you, Kamalji. Thank you, Gordon, Chester, for a fantastic presentation. And I agree with the points that have been brought up, others, Tara and Ray included. I think very simply, Gordon, you did a great job of clarifying the distinction between lobbying in its official form and advocacy and education. And I think that's what you're alluding to, Kanwaljit, as well, with respect to the navigation work stream. And I think that's where, with the coalition and the group that is SHIP-MD, really beginning to help clarify the issues to folks, perhaps so many that don't deal with the pediatric world on a regular basis, helping them to understand where the connections are, where things need to be integrated, where the potential solutions and pathways are for improving things, both on a short, medium, and a long-term scale. I think those are the areas that SHIP-MD, from an advocacy, education, clarification type of agenda, that we could potentially do. But I also want to be clear that the fundamental aspect here, and one of the priorities and foundational tenets of SHIP, is to really set up this system that becomes a national platform that creates a safe environment for optimizing and creating greater efficiencies and streamlining the process for evidence generation and technology innovation and device development for pediatrics, right? That's our first and foremost. And all of those other aspects certainly need to be considered and are important, no doubt are important. And we want to be able to prioritize that work with respect to the amount of resource bandwidth that we have.
Thank you, Basam. Okay, there has been another question by Stephen Anderson. Can SHIP-MD help persuade the American Medical Association to begin prioritizing the development of Category 1 CPT codes for pediatric procedures and technologies? Yes, Gordon.
Kanwaljit, I'm going to take a shot. But I'm going to ask Tina. I meet her all the time at the AMA CPT meeting, so she's familiar with this space. Three things. One, there are two different kinds of CPT codes now, Category 1, Category 3. Category 3 are for emerging technology, and they have a lower level of evidence in order to get one of these T codes, a Category 3 code. Sometimes when you get it, because it doesn't have that much evidence, payers will look at it and say, that's nice, you got a code, but we're not going to cover it. And so this link between coding and coverage is very important. Category 1 typically will have payment, but not necessarily coverage. You've got to get all three. But Steve's question, I think, is carefully focused on if we're dealing with the AMA CPT panel, the American Academy of Pediatrics is a vibrant, valuable voice at the AMA because it's generally run with respect to the specialty society who typically will submit an application. And so AAP could be a valuable member. And the third point is there's an interesting precedent in the pathology area. There's a pathology coding caucus, and they have a sort of a parallel coding process where things are run with unique standards for molecular diagnostics. If we've got a need for Chester to get something that just goes beyond robotic-assisted laparoscopy codes for pediatrics, there are significant clinical resource distinctions, then I think it's a great idea. And yes, AAP could be of tremendous value in that process. Tina?
Yeah, I totally agree with everything you said, Gordon. Honestly, it is driven by the specialty societies, but if we have some role to play as SHIP, I think that would be totally appropriate. Just to highlight, that these device therapies that are being incubated are warranting a higher coding consideration.
Right. It is, Chester, if I could add, I'll give you a very focused remarks on that because as a urologist, we hear about our National Society, the AUA, mention how important it is to have representation at that. But we've heard also that the process is really a zero sum, where if someone gets more codes, someone else is going to drop. And so it's a very interesting dynamic, and it sounds like both Gordon and Tina are very aware. And I don't know if you can provide any insight about, there's a question on that, but please do.
No, you're absolutely right, Chester. And what it is there's a limited number of codes within the numbering system, and that is one element. And then it's the Relative Value Update Committee, the RUC, that has to everybody has to play nicely in the sandbox. So if you want a code that's priced appropriately, that is going to take away from someone else's code. So there's a lot of politics at play in that system.
Unmute. Wait, you're on mute.
Me, but I just want to point out that Category 3 code, although it's not tied to a RUC review and RVU assessment, it often is a pathway to a Category 1 code, and it may be debatable whether that accelerates it or not, but I think it's increasingly likely that a Category 3 will be a pathway to Category 1.
Well, Chief, I will only underscore Wade's point. Since the creation of the Category 3 process, it has become the tool of choice when the AMA is looking at a new innovative device coming in at an early stage. It is almost inevitable. Some payers will actually establish payments there, but I think a company needs to be prepared to work with the specialty society, get the application in, and this can take a year or more to get a Category 3 code, 5 articles, back with the AMA to get the Category 1 code. It is a multi-year effort on coding with parallel efforts on coverage.
I'm just going to add that from in life at all aspects, we need to move away from the zero-sum aspect of things. I saw a movie that came out a couple of years ago that helped the world understand that, right?
And that is exactly the problem with pediatrics, because it's zero sum. There's only so much gold in the pot, so to speak, right? And then if you take it from somewhere else, someone else is going to get less. So yeah, I get it. There's another very interesting question comparing drugs with devices, and Ron Day saying that I imagine someone has also thought about SHIP D, D for drugs, like MDs for medical devices. It is very difficult to get reimbursement to treat children with the drugs that are approved for adults with devices. Maybe we can take a look at post-market tracking of approved adult devices in children. I think, Vasum, you might be perhaps the perfect person to answer this question. What is your thought about that?
Yeah, so perhaps you can clarify that first portion about drugs versus medical devices, right? Are they separate questions, or are they from two different folks, or just
no, it's the same question, a part of the same question. So basically, that person is saying that perhaps we could look into the drug example to see how things have been handled in the drug side and try to emulate in some way in the medical devices field.
Sure, I'll try to keep my points brief, and I'm sure others have perspective here as well. But just to contextualize this, I think folks may be aware that the movement towards improvement in the pediatric drug space has taken quite a bit of effort and time. We really want to think back to the Orphan Drug Act, and that was back in the 70s and 80s. BPCA, PREA, those have really begun to change how we are thinking about the pediatric and rare disease drug development market. There were certainly at the very beginning a lot of pushback around that as well, really reconsidering, thoughtfully considering, do we need programs of that nature? Are they going to be beneficial? Are they going to cause more consternation or problems? And over the last few decades, things have begun to pick up. And I think those legislative efforts have really made a difference. However, we've got to recognize that on the device side, specifically on the pediatric device side, there are very distinct aspects between the pediatric drug market and the pediatric device market. And if we are going to be pursuing or considering legislative opportunities similar to the history in the pediatric drug side, then I think we need to consider what those right opportunities, right legislative options would be for the pediatric device market and all the innovators in that market. So, that's a topic that we discussed at the 2018 public meeting on pediatric device development at the FDA, which was very well attended, and I think it's an important topic for us to consider. But right now, I think with respect to the, again, bandwidth resources that we're focusing on with respect to the development of ShipMD, we really want to make something that will work for pediatric device development.
Thanks, Vasim. Anyone else in the panel have any thoughts about that drug versus device comparison?
And just add, I think we look at drugs and experience of CPATH, International Needle Consortium. I think look at it as a success story. So I think many believe that is a great example of a public-private partnership that works, and I think ShipMD should be that and could be that as well in the future. So.
Yeah, now that you're talking about CPATH, Joseph Sharon, who's the CEO of Critical Path Institute, is actually on the panel. I'll invite him to provide his perspective. Joseph, do you have any thoughts about it?
To add an additional comment here, there exists already the IACT organization, which is helping to develop drugs within the context of children. So there are some organizations already who are active within this field. Maybe not the same kind of setup as SHIP, but as you looked at some of the presentations, the IACT was looked at as one of the examples how you could set up the ShipMD organization. So I just wanted to make you aware of that. That IACT organization, by the way, was a spin-off from the CPATH organization earlier in a couple of years ago.
Gordon, Tina, Wade, if you have any. Yes, Gordon, go ahead.
Kawaljeet, if I can aim a question at Wade from our earlier session. There was some interest in the kinds of data that manufacturers need to generate in order to get reimbursement. Wade's been involved with this a long time, and I'm going to just sort of throw that broad question, Wade. What when you're doing technology evaluation and assessment, what do you need to see, and what are the payers now establishing as the standards?
Well, I would say that payers are generally looking for well-designed clinical trials with appropriate comparators, appropriately powered, with appropriate inclusion, exclusion, criteria and outcome measures with significant duration. They're basically looking for good evidence of improved health outcomes. And they may require more than one study to show consistency of results over, investigators and sites. In general, multi-center trials are better than single-site trials. And payers use evidence-based criteria to look at this. So the one I referred to in the last session was the Blue Cross Blue Shield Association Tech Assessment Criteria, which basically look at FDA approval or clearance, if applicable. They look at the quality of the evidence. Is there sufficient evidence to conclude that there's an effect on health outcomes? And having determined that, do the beneficial health outcomes outweigh the harmful health outcomes? And does the improvement in outcomes is it as least as beneficial as established alternatives? And then the last one is basically, can the results of improvement be attainable outside the research or investigational setting? So not all payers use that, but for over 30 years, they've been used by the Technology Evaluation Center, now called Evidence Street, BCBSA, and those have also been used by other payers like Kaiser Permanente and Aetna and Cigna. That's what payers are generally looking for. It's a high bar of evidence. Some regional payers may not have quite as high a bar and may be influenced by economic arguments, or may develop some flexible coverage policies. But for a big national payer, the evidence bar is pretty high.
I do have another question for the panel. Anyone can answer depending upon how you guys feel about it. Do you see any linkages between the SHIP's role for reimbursement and hospital criteria?
I want to take a shot at that. I'm going to invite my colleagues, but I have another question for Tina when we get this one wrapped up. If there was a hospital in a state where the Medicaid program or there was a private payer where that hospital had a uniquely good history of engagement with the payer, I'd say that might be one of the considerations as the hospital criteria workstream continues to refine and build out its opportunities on which of the hospitals that would qualify. So the flip side of that, if there are hospitals who've been developing innovative pediatric devices and they've been banging their heads against the hard wall of payers' resistance and reluctance or just lack of money, I think that might also be a consideration in terms of how we want to prioritize those hospitals where we believe we're going to get better traction just because they've got a positive prior experience with local payers.
Thank you, Gordon. Anyone else have any thoughts about this?
I just want to echo what Gordon said, because I do agree that there are some states where the Medicaid agencies are notoriously difficult to work with, or they have a very fragmented commercial payer population. So it would be more difficult to kind of foster this relationship where they would think of the SHIP hospital as being a center where they could really provide some differential coverage coding payments. So I can think of several, but there are many agencies within the state Medicaid world that have historically been willing to listen. However, we're in a different era now. We turned a corner after last year because the hospitals can attest, I'm sure, that Medicaid agencies don't have very much funding, right? So those dollars that they were able to kind of look at a little differently are now squeezed tighter. Their enrollment numbers have gone up as unemployment went up, and we have a different economic story for hospitals. And so it'll be difficult to make any real connection between what happened in the past and then what is going to happen or is happening now with state Medicaid agencies. So that would be my I guess, proviso to that guidance that, yes, it's very possible that you can have a center that could make better relationships, but if they had those relationships in the past, they may not get the same benefit now.
Add to that conversation, I mean, I think what we know we need in pediatric devices is that we can't make our population bigger, but hopefully speed of development, speed of approval, speed of reimbursement can be improved to make investors interested, to make stakeholders interested in being in this area. So I think, and we briefly went over this concept, but say that perfect world that we had more pediatric breakthrough designations, and say, yes, we had this concept of a Medicaid or pediatric NTAP program, new technology add-on program, where actually innovators and developers could get some payments during the development process while they're running clinical trial. So granted, there may be limited dollars for Medicaid, but if some of those can be made available to manufacturing developers early in the process, I think we may see more activity, more devices for kids. So
this, hi, Wade. Wade, yeah.
We're talking about Medicaid, but I just wanted to say a word about commercial insurers. I think the SHIP program, the SHIP hospitals as centers of innovation, when it's established, I think it will be attractive to commercial payers as sort of a center of excellence for innovation. And I think payers are more flexible when it comes to kids with serious diseases. And I think they do recognize that there may not be, large numbers of patients for large-scale clinical trials. And there may, there have been examples of like the Pediatric Cancer Network that the Blue Cross Blue Shield Association set up that provided coverage for treatment of rare tumors like Wilms tumor, based on NIH guidelines, even though there wasn't a whole lot of evidence of certain best practices. So I think that would be sort of an opportunity for partnerships between commercial insurers because they're going to be faced with appeals for pediatric patients who need certain technologies, and they're going to have to deal with that anyway. But there's an opportunity, I think, for some type of center of excellence type of relationship with commercial payers.
Conwell G., can I aim a question at Tina?
Go ahead.
Tina, I'm going to go back to Chester's robotic-assisted laparoscopy for his patients with some serious urology. That technology is going to get better and better and better in Chester's hands. And at some point, it's going to move from the inpatient basis to the outpatient basis. And I'm wondering, because we've been focusing very much on that inpatient NTAP, can you talk for a minute about what could be opportunities when you look at that innovation migrating from an inpatient to an outpatient basis?
It's a great question, Gordon. And we do see, a lot of the policy that was passed in the last year has been focused on creating opportunities for clinicians to determine the best setting of care and really moving things downstream that are able to be moved into an outpatient setting. So while Gordon did talk about the new technology add-on payment, there's also the transitional pass-through device payment system within the hospital outpatient system. It doesn't really apply to the ambulatory surgery center. It's not quite that far downstream, but there is a payment differentiator for technologies that meet certain criteria, and the breakthrough designation from FDA with the new MCIT regulation that just came down, it eases that path toward getting that payment differential, but it doesn't have to be a breakthrough technology. It just has to be new enough, it has to meet the cost threshold, and it has to substantially improve outcomes relative to the existing technology. So yes, I do think that there is an opportunity to look at all settings of care. Physician office-based procedures don't really have that structure. They are still in a pretty firm fee-for-service world, but those with the prospective payment systems have recognized that devices won't get market access. They won't be able to be used on patients if the hospitals aren't able to afford to buy them and wait for the payment systems to catch up. So that's helpful.
No. There's a question from the audience, Catherine Olson, and she's asking, does ShipMD plan to provide resources for helping companies to define a specific APR, DRGs, severities, and current procedure costs that are relevant to determining the device reimbursement strategy? This information can be, in ordinary circumstances, very expensive to obtain. Gordon, any thoughts about that?
You know, number one, we certainly have some expertise now, but I welcome Vasam's weighing in. The SHIP plan to provide resources. I think, you know, part of the opportunity as you look at launching SHIP is what are the resources, what are the first priorities. I think I mentioned before, there's, you know, some of the low-hanging fruit can be educational, navigational tools that are available to everyone, which I think are much more low cost than individual consulting. But Vasam, I know you've been facing this issue for some time and frankly would welcome your answers and thoughts about this question.
Sure, no, thanks Gordon for allowing me to chime in. Number one, I think these questions that are coming from the audience are fantastic. Going back to that point originally about, you know, are the hospital workstream and the reimbursement workstream, is there connections and absolutely. Although these are being presented in subsections, the intent here is to focus on certain areas. There absolutely is integration. This is intended to be an integrated system, not just each entity or each workstream working on their own. So that's number one. Number two, to get to the point around education, which is the focus of this question and what Gordon is getting to, I agree. Like, getting access to education, getting access to information can be very challenging at times. As the questioner pointed out, it can also be expensive at times. What we need to think about for developing a national ecosystem like SHIP, once again, is to figure out, look, we've got to get this off the ground. And we want to prioritize the foundational aspects here. And education certainly is going to be important. We're going to want to get that information out, and perhaps those are things that we can work on, resources permitting, also down the line, once we can get the system to work. Or we can be doing those simultaneously with respect to small subgroups. Again, assuming that the resources are committed. You know, many people don't recognize that, you know, individuals like Gordon, Chester, and so many others that have put their time and effort into this across the coordinating committee and even in the EC are doing this in a sense, volunteer time. It's a collaborative effort for sure, but I think we just need to be clear about that for the audience as well in terms of how we've been able to get to where we are today.
I think is this Catherine Olson's question, Conwell G?
Let me just double check.
Yeah.
Yep, it's Catherine Olson.
Yeah, Catherine, it's a very good question because what you're also asking defines a particular need. So you're talking about defining the specific DRGs, varies, and current procedure costs that are relevant. You know, what you're also talking about, if you had to ask this in another way, is do we need and can we get a reimbursement landscape or a reimbursement feasibility study that can identify what's out there and where the gaps are? And that's a good question. It's a good place to start because a lot of people will pick up the phone and call a consultant and say, I need a code. Can you get me a code? And the question you're asking is a good one because it looks broadly at what's the environment. After that, you can figure out, okay, what are the strategies you need, what are the tactics, how you're going to implement them. And whether or not that emerges as an opportunity for SHIP, I think is important. But it's very good that you're asking a question which looks at the big picture first.
Thank you, Gordon, and thank you so much, Catherine. Thanks again. There are just a reminder for time check. We have 9 minutes left in the main meeting today, and I have I think about 4 more questions to go through. One is a question by Gary Dulac. Given the fact that we're talking about limited markets, which is the source of our challenge, is there I'm actually getting a bit of a background noise. So if you're not answering, would you please put yourself on mute? So the question from Gary was that given the fact we are talking about limited market, which is really a source of our challenge, is there a discussion going on with the payers, or will there be a discussion with the payers about total spend when creating new codes? Yes, Gordon.
The answer is yes, Gary, but there are actually 2 important questions embedded. If you're talking to a payer and you've got a limited number of patients, I think it's a great part of your dialogue to say, we got an expensive device, an expensive procedure for a little kid who's really sick, and we need you to step up to the plate and put in a little amount of money for that. I mean, this is not going to break the bank for United Healthcare, Cigna. Frank, I don't think we're asking for too much. So you need to start that discussion and engaging. But I would also be very careful, because part of your question is payers about total spend when creating new codes. This goes back to a point that Tina made. Payers don't make codes. The AMA CPT makes codes, and the RUC committee assigns payment amounts for those physicians. And there you're going to find some potential resistance if there's one pie and everybody's got to cut their particular slice. There's another dialogue, the physician payment, AMA RUC, separate from the payers. Good question, complicated answer.
And Kamal, if I could just, very quickly, I know we've got some other questions to get to, but I want to kind of build on what Gordon just mentioned, a key point about, a certain company being too challenging to be able to reimburse quote unquote a few number of devices. And this gets back to the integration aspect that we talked about earlier, right? So for instance, if we have, let's just, just for the sake of this conversation for simplicity, let's just say we have 10 qualified SHIP hospitals across the country in 10 separate states. Each of those Medicaid state directors, for the number of devices that may go through those hospitals, it may not be, and I don't want to be absolute, but it may not be some huge number. These aren't going to necessarily be, thousands and thousands of devices being evaluated in that specific hospital. It might be 5, 10, 20 across all within each of the hospitals, within each of the states, which, back to Gordon's point, may not break the bank for some of the budgetary authorities that the Medicaid directors have, and even as Wade has always brought back up, even in the private sector as well. But we've got to be cognizant of that, because that's how we're going to think through and create an integrated system that actually makes sense, that can work. So we have to also make sure that that's clear to everyone when we're thinking through this, right? So it's possible to make that system work, since it may not be requiring huge additional funds. As Tina pointed out, everybody's strapped. This isn't intended to be zero sum. We got to move away from that. But within the system that we have, within the resources that we have, this is potentially doable. Let's try to make that work.
Thanks, Prasanna. Another question from Warren Williams. Can new devices fit in the existing code? If yes, what would be the criteria?
I'll take that one.
Yes, yeah, go ahead.
I'll at least start it off. We had this excellent conversation at the last session as well. Yes, there are some devices that just naturally are going to fit into the reimbursement structures. So it's important to do a full and thorough analysis of what the landscape looks like out in the payer universe. So perhaps starting with Medicare, who typically, if they have made a national coverage determination, you fit within it, that's a good place to start. Then look at your state Medicaid agencies to see if you fit within their either policy on coverage or if your code is paid. Medicaid agency websites are notoriously difficult to navigate, but perhaps you can find a friendly provider who can help you with that. One of your PIs or one of your thought leaders would be ideal, and then the commercial payers as well. So you might have a technology that doesn't need to establish coverage coding and payment as long as you fit within the rubric. So there are ways for you to take a look. And one of the points that I think is important for this audience to hear as well is that reimbursement is a core competency of any device manufacturer's process. So you have to be there at the very beginning in the research and development, in the clinical trial planning, because showing value to the payers is the way that you get the door open. So especially for small niche device uses. I come from the world of ventricular assist devices, very expensive, small population treated, and that argument to payers that we're not going to break your bank because you're not going to see more than 10 of these patients a year really does work.
Just agree with what Tina said. You know, that's basically the first thing you do is see if your device fits into an existing code. I mean, you don't want to spend time or a consultant to do a code application if you've got something that fits in. The flip side to it is if you've got something which is really want to differentiate, that it's really unique, then it sort of begs for having its own unique code, because as part of marketing, you'll want to highlight how different it is and how better it is. If it's fitting into an existing code and you're saying it's like everything else, in some cases that might send some mixed messages.
Another question that I have received offline is, are we aware of any state Medicaid systems that may be immediately amenable to provide funding or participating in a pilot with ChipMD?
What was the question, Kanwalji?
So are we aware of, So the question was, are we aware of any state Medicaid systems that may be immediately amenable to providing funding or participating in a pilot project with ChipMD in the more immediate term?
Yeah. This is Chester. I mean, I'd say there's definitely something that the Workstream has already started to look at. As we know that there unfortunately may need to be 51 different solutions because there are 51 different state Medicaid programs, and some may be perhaps more amenable, but that is definitely a process step to start one by one, looking at the state Medicaid programs and specifically their medical directors, who a lot of times can help make those hopefully positive decisions towards this. I'd like to bring up also the fact, I thought the question was really about our resources available for device innovators. This came up in the first session, and I would say, ShipMD is not running yet, but I would say that the Pediatric Device Consortia, there are 5 of us in the country, all supported by FDA 50 grants. They're available now. So if you have a device and need some assistance, we are all available now. We all have, we call direct device funding or seed funding. We have funds that can perhaps help cover your costs for a reimbursement consultant, regulatory consultant, developmental costs that would be helpful. That all pretty much is a no strings attached type arrangement. So thank you.
Thanks, Chester. Yes, Gordon.
I just wanted, Deborah Mansell asked a great question about devices that include data costs because they may be smart data. This is so important because there are a lot of innovative devices which are based on generating data. It goes up to the web. It comes down to a doctor like Chester, and he makes decisions. But the acquisition, the analysis, and the transmission of that data represent a whole new part of medical device innovation. And there's a lot of questions about, this is not telemedicine. This is telemanagement medicine. And the payers, coverage coding and payment, are struggling with that. Good question. Cutting edge issue and reimbursement. More to come.
Thank you. Thanks, Gordon. Any last minute thoughts by the panel? Any specific thoughts you want to convey to the audience before we close?
I would just say that I think that, the SHIP PMD structure and vision is going to, potentially make a big difference in terms of flexible coverage, evidence generation, partnerships. We really haven't had anything like this, I think, for at least commercial payers to sort of look towards as a center of excellence. And so I think that, I encourage all of you to, keep working on this. It's got a lot of promise.
Thank you so much. So with that, we come to an end to our session.